Good evening, Urmila. Good evening. Hello, Dr. Dickens.
Evening.
Good to see you. Yeah. And hi,
Hello,
Merin.
doctor.
Hi,
Hello.
hi.
Hi,
Hi,
hi, hi.
Merin.
Hi, Merin.
Hello,
Hi.
ma'am. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Urmila.
Hi, hi,
Hi.
Merin.
Hi.
Hello, sir.
Hello, Urmila, ma'am.
Hi,
Urmila, this is Dr. Dickens.
hello.
Uh, and that's Merin from MCC.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello.
And Dr. Samuel Rufus, the mentor of our group. Sir, can you come on screen? Or
Okay.
can you just unmute at least?
Yes, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. Hello, Merin.
That's Dr. Dickens, a young professor from Calcutta.
Hi, sir. Hello, Urmila, ma'am.
Hello, sir.
Hello,
Yes.
Rufus, sir.
Hello,
Hello, Dr.
Merin, ma'am.
Dickens, sir.
Yes.
So, Namrata, we can start. Namrata, our compere for today. Sorry, Narmada. Narmada.
Uh, I think there's no Narmata in the list. Are you there, Maria?
Preethi?
Yeah, she's not able to. I'll give her a minute. If she's not able to log in, I'll take over. Yeah.
Okay.
She's in, no? Okay.
Can we start, ma'am?
Yes.
Greetings to you all. Welcome to the fourth edition of Fortnightly Symposium of In Tandem Research Club. I am Narmada, Secretary of In Tandem Research Club and Research Scholar, doing my full-time PhD and Queen Mary's. In Tandem Research Club has been conducting fortnightly symposium, and the topics that have been presented in the last three symposiums are autobiographies, writing self, community and nation, Adivasi experience in literature and literary studies, and cultural studies. Today's topic is comparative literature, and this is going to be a panel discussion. The chairperson for today's symposium is Mr. Leonard Dickens, Assistant Professor, Center for Studies in Social Sciences. He is also the adjunct faculty in Center for Comparative Literature, University of Hyderabad. He secured his bachelor degree in English literature from the prestigious institution Loyola College. He received his master's degree in English from University of Hyderabad. He has received his Masters of Philosophy in Comparative Literature and Doctor of Philosophy in Comparative Literature from University of Hyderabad, respectively. Dr. Dickens Leonard researched on the writings of 19th century Tamil intellectual Ayodhi Das and Tamil Buddhism for his PhD from University of Hyderabad, Telangana, India. He was formerly DAAD visiting PhD fellow at the Center for Modern Indian Studies, George August University, Göttingen, Germany. His interests lie in literary studies, comparative literature, film and cultural studies, translation, and the history of anti-caste thought. He is largely interested in critical humanities in the intersection of these disciplines as it paves the way towards a meaningful and transformative pedagogy for human sciences. Besides researching and recently teaching in this area, his current research explores anti-caste intellectual thought and comparative cultural studies in India. His research publications largely explore how anti-caste intellectuals engaged with religion and literature in the context of colonialism and print in India, and also on contemporary Tamil cinema and culture. He has recently received Fulbright Nehru postdoctoral research grant, where he wishes to collect and analyze material on what he calls shadow modernity, the most oppressed communities' engagement with colonial modernity, which provided opportunities for new employment and made travel conditional. The project would study migration and print with a critical anti-race and caste framework, and it would centralize and compare the Dalit point of view with that of African American experience. The plan is to look into the archives of 19th and 20th century print that were run by African Americans and conceptualize the ethical dimensions of these movements against inherited inequalities and entrenched oppression. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Urmila.
We have three speakers for the day. Panelist Dr. S. Urmila, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Queen Mary's College. The topic is Comparative Literature, Aim and Scope and Introduction. The second panelist will be Dr. Preethi Srinivasan, Head and Associate Professor, Department of English, Queen Mary's College. The topic is Education and Literacy, Insights from Australian Aboriginal and Dalit Life Stories. The third panelist will be Dr. P. Merin Wilson, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Madras Christian College. The topic will be Comparative Literature in India. We welcome you all. I hand over the session to the chairperson and the panelists.
Thank you, Narmata, for this very extensively, and very kind introduction, if I'd say, and also other panelist member, very erudite topics here before us. First of all, let me congratulate the college for bringing me in and also doing this very important discussion amongst the young scholars, and but also in Chennai, particularly in Chennai, doing the very critical discussion on literature, culture studies, are very, very enriching topics you've had in the past few. I wish you all the very best, and I also would like to be part of your forthcoming interesting ventures like this in the digital mode and perhaps in physical, kind of presence as well at the college. And I was in Loyola, so I was staying across. It was very long back, really long back uh, when I moved over to Hyderabad. So thank you once again, Maria, particularly Dr. Maria, for pulling me into this discussion. It's really nice to have to be part of any discussion and engagement that comes from Chennai. So let me now, without any further ado, any further delay, go to the discussion. As Maria sent me the list, there are three presenters you all know, taking up different kinds of discussions with the titles. If you have come to sense, comparative literature disciplinism, and I've been trained in this for the last 12 years in the discipline in Hyderabad. And quite a lot of arrival to this discipline is via the English literary studies. Most of us would have done MA in English, and then we'll take a kind of a jump in, with our left leg and right leg, inside outside culture studies and comparative literature, right? So there is a very liminal, critical, disciplinary question, but also the question of existence. What is comparative literature? And I think our very interesting presenters here are going to discuss this, and I'm going to place it in an order which I think Maria suggested to me, and I think it's perfect. I think it's wonderful in the way in which the argument can be pushed as what I call, as what one can call as a certain kind of a, if not a dialectic, at least a trajectory, right? If there's a trajectory, a dialectic is a very loaded term, but if you want to say it's a trajectory, a second of viewpoints from which we can understand comparative literature as practice, as discipline, but also as a critical inquiry of ideas, of thought, of reading, perhaps writing, right, and so on and so forth. So we have three topics here with us. First, as I've said, I was speaking as Maria suggested, Urmila would go ahead with telling us about the idea of topic of comparative literature itself, its aim and scope. So she'll go first, Dr. Urmila, and then after which Dr. Merin, who discuss particularly about comparative literature in India, right? It's very and also she wants to link it with the growth of culture studies. While the earlier presenter would try to look at the role of translations, while the second presenter would also look at the growth of culture studies, and the last one would dive into something very detailed, what can be done with comparative literature, and she would bring in two distinct but relative kind of narratives. The Dalit narratives, particularly foregrounding Kumud Pavde's Marathi writer, English translation work vis-a-vis the work of Australian Aboriginal writers, right? And see, especially in English, what happens, right? So we have very distinct and exciting topics presenting, but I'm keen to look out what is your voice, how do you take in, how do you discuss, and see whether there's a conversation which is possible, which is open up for younger scholars to think about and also link it with our present, the kind of research that we're doing. So I keenly look forward to this event. So over to, shall we keep 15 to 20 minutes presentation, if that is fine,
Yes, sir.
each paper,
Yeah, that
and
would
then,
be.
yeah, and
Yes.
then probably general practices, if people can present it first, and then we can take the questions. How was it practiced here? After the
Yeah,
presenters,
we'll
or
have all the three presentations and then
great,
the discussion.
great, great. So we'll have the three presentations together, and then we can take on the questions. While I say this, you can also simultaneously, express your ideas, questions in the chat box, so that as a record, if you sometimes forget, we can come back to it once in the discussion. So over to Dr. Urmila. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Dickens. I would like to thank Dr. Maria Preethi, the head of the department, for giving us such opportunities to interact with the students on different platforms other than our regular teaching. So I'm really happy. And even though I had to pitch in the last minute, I was able to uh, actually present today because this particular topic was very dear to me. It has been very dear to me, and my research also happens to be comparative study of the treatment of women characters in Valmiki's Ramayana and Homer's Iliad, well, maybe from a feministic uh, perspective, feminist perspective. So that way, I thought I can really offer some input, some kind of an insight into comparative literature in general, and maybe a few things in particular, because there is also Ms. Merin from MCC who will be able to talk about the practices of comparative literature in India in particular. So mine will be a general outlook, a general view of comparative literature, and how it actually started, and what actually we should look for when we are taking it up as a kind of a research. So this will be actually very simple, so that the students will be able to take something from this. So it is meant basically for students. So because I find that in many colleges, in the curriculum, comparative literature is not included. But when I was a student way back, maybe in 1985, 35 years back, we had a paper on comparative literature. And that is how I developed a kind of interest in comparative studies. And even for my MPhil dissertation, I had taken the treatment of the myth of Karna in TP Kailasam and Raman. So since then, I had been very much interested in comparative literature studies. And I feel that every college should bring this as part of the curriculum, because it has got a very wide scope. Even though we have other kinds of literary criticism coming in, interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, comparative literature is it has got a very wide scope, very wide range of topics can be explored, and it will be very, very handy for the researchers to begin with. So what I would like to say at the outset is that comparison is a very common human tendency. Preethi, will you be able to share the screen of my PPT? The PPT is just for you to remember the points. So I may be referring to the points which are there in the PPT. At the
Yes,
same time,
Urmila. Nancy will
you can
share the
take
screen.
yeah, the second slide probably. The students may not be able to remember all the points, so this is only for future reference that I've prepared the PPT, but it would be better if the students listen to the presentations. So the second slide, I just want to mention at the very outset that comparison is a very common human tendency. So whenever we meet people or whenever we talk about anything, we tend to compare. So it's a very, very common, basic, natural human tendency. So when it comes to study, it becomes all the more imperative that we tend to compare. So whenever we talk about comparative studies, we know that the basic premise is we look for points of similarities and some point of intersection, definitely. So whenever we read a particular author or a text, we tend to look for comparisons. It comes automatically, it comes very naturally. And maybe when we do it more consciously, it becomes a study. Otherwise, there is a common human tendency for us to compare anything. So that is what I want to start with. And we always look for commonality, some kind of a common factor. So comparison itself means there should be some ground for comparison. So we can't be studying totally incomparable texts or authors. We cannot do that. So we need to find some common denominator, some common factor, which will enable this comparative study possible. And we always, comparatives talk about the comparisons which may be pertaining to the form, the theme, the characters, the language part of it, the narrative style, the situations, the experiences, insights, name anything, anything that any aspect of literature can be compared. And broadly speaking, that will come under stylistics and maybe thematology. Stylistics will refer more to the form, and then we have meaning. So these are the two things which we always look for, and we have subsections under each of these. So basically, comparative studies will pertain to stylistics or thematology. And I remember my teachers always referring to Rene Welleck and Austin Warren, their book, The Theory of Literature, where they talk about the comparative literature, where they talk about literary history, they talk about genre studies, okay, several things they used to bring in, and where I still remembered the terms which were used by my teachers while referring to the concepts of comparative literature, especially the idea of influences. And it is possible that a writer is influenced by his predecessor or his contemporary. It is quite possible. So we try to study influences here and imitation sometimes. So and, very interestingly, they draw kind of a line between influence studies and imitation. What they want to say here is influence is a kind of unconscious imitation, and imitation is a conscious influence. So these two questions definitely pop up whenever we take any two works of art for comparison. And there are also other interesting areas like inheritance and affinities. Okay, we have east-west affinities, east-west relations, which can be studied under comparison. And borrowings, okay, like when it comes to languages, so we have one particular language borrowing something from the other and trying to adapt itself, okay, to make it a better language and things like that. English itself is a language which is borrowed from several other languages. So that way comparison is very much possible even with languages. So these are some of the aspects which I wanted to mention, so that when you approach a particular work of art with a view to making a comparative study, you can look for influences, you can look for imitation or inheritance or affinities or even borrowings. And the very next aspect which I would like to dwell upon is that comparison does not mean similarities alone. So we bring in contrast and differences as well. So just by equating two works of art or two authors, we are not trying to say that this person is just equal to this person, and we are not trying to assert superiority of one over the other. It is not that. So when we are comparing, we look for similarities. At the same time, we also look for differences and contrast, because differences only make a person highly unique. So suppose we take the Romantic period, even though there is a common thread running along all poetry by all the Romantic poets, it is that there is individuality, there is uniqueness for each of the writer. So comparative study will have to take care of both similarities and differences or contrast, so that we give the due credit to each individual writer. Even though we may compare the narrative style or other aspects of writing expression or the themes or whatever, each writer is different. So automatically we will end up with that. But only thing is, we need to take into consideration the benefits of comparison. A comparative study always leads to a better understanding of the authors, okay, and also a proper appreciation of literature. And it also widens our horizon of knowledge. And we try to look at everything from a larger perspective. So it is very much possible, because once I take up just one particular author and do a research on that, I will be more inclined to do more and more study of that particular author. But when I try to compare, I try to learn another language or another literature, another culture, another society. So that way our perspective will get widened, definitely. And research, dear students, I would like to make it very clear here, research is actually research. So people before us, whoever has done research on that particular area or field of study, they would have searched for something, they would have looked for something. But we keep looking for more and more in that area. and we get a different kind of a perspective. So each one has a different kind of an approach to the study of a work of art. So that is why it is even called research. Okay, even though we call it as a single term, research, it actually means research. Keep searching again and again so that you try to get new perspectives. And recently, I just finished my refresher course. I was exposed to a lot of new literatures. So even there, I pointed out it is not only getting to know about new literatures, it is also getting to know about new perspectives even to the old literatures, other forms of literature which we are already familiar with. So it is all a different kind of a perspective that we are talking about. And one more advantage of comparative studies is that it brings people and societies and nations together, because we try to learn about their culture, and there is a lot of interaction between the East and the West, or even within a country like India, which is multicultural. We can bring people and societies together. And there is already the concept of global literature, world literature, and comparative literature crosses boundaries. So that is where they want to bring in the idea of world literature, or even global literature, so that they even talk about global culture. They want to bring the whole of humanity under one umbrella, and they want to use this term global literature or even world literature. And sometimes comparative literature is considered as synonymous with world literature. So uh, even though comparative literature actually started in the West, as with any other study, be it English language teaching or any other study, comparative literature also started in the West, and they wanted to study East-West relations, and then it moved over to Oriental nations later, particularly East Asian nations. By Oriental, they mean East Asian nations, but it started including Asian nations. And India also was included in that, because we have a rich heritage and we have a long, what you say, we have a legacy. So with regard to, even though we started having Indian writing in English much, much later, we have a very rich legacy by way of literature. So it spread to Oriental nations later. And in India, maybe comparative literature as a discipline is this maybe more than half a century old. And I remember Professor Dickens is from Calcutta. Maybe, yeah, he'll be able to throw much light on how Jadavpur University wanted to begin. This department way back, they established in 1956 itself. In the year 1956, a separate department for comparative literature was established in Jadavpur University. And maybe in other universities like University of Hyderabad, they have a separate department for comparative literature. So in the last 50, 60 years, there's a lot of work that has been going on in the field of comparative studies in India. And in India, the scope is very wide, because India is a multilingual country. So we have several literatures. Even though we have Indian writing in English, we have regional literatures in regional languages, or regional literatures even in English. So a lot of study can be made, because India is a multilingual country and it's a multicultural nation. And here I would like to point out the role of translations. So even though it is very ideal that a comparatist, if at all he or she is working on two different languages, it is very ideal that the comparatist knows both the languages. But it calls for mastery of both the languages. See, for example, when I started working on Valmiki's Ramayana and Homer's Iliad, I did not know both the languages. Sanskrit, I did not know. Maybe a little bit of it I could manage, but Greek, totally out of my reach. So to be able to master two languages and to be able to compare literature or work of art from two different languages may be a lifetime challenge for anybody. So that is where we understand the role of translations. So there are people who are against the idea of translations, but there are people who vouch for translations. So translations play a very important role in bringing literatures together. So even in a country like India, like suppose I want to compare Tamil literature to Malayalam literature, without dependence on a translation, I may not be able to make a comparative study. And while we choose text in translation, we should be careful. We should go for authentic texts. So, for example, I had a difficulty. So, with regard to Ramayana translations, we know that there are about more than 300 Ramayanas. Several translations have come out. So, that way, we had a difficulty. So, we have to look for authentic translations. But the role of translations cannot be denied while we do comparative studies. And definitely, those who know both the languages will have an edge over others, no doubt about it. But it's a lifetime challenge for many of us. So we depend on translations. They play a very vital role, and it's a very important tool for researchers and scholars. And they have to choose the correct translation. So that's one thing I want to bring in here for the sake of research scholars, because that need not deter us from taking up literatures for study. And even in literature, that is what they say. They justify the role of translation, saying that sometimes even Anton Chekhov is, we think of him as English, as an English writer. So translations have become almost like the original. There are umpteen number of texts which have been translated so well, it looks almost like the original. So only thing is, the caution must be that we should rely on very authentic translations. So coming back once again to, just for the sake of reinforcement, I want you to know what is comparative literature, the definition part of it. So it's a discipline of studying literature internationally, transnational literature we call it, across national borders, so across time periods. So like Iliad and Ramayana, they belong to two different periods of history. So that way, even that was allowed. Okay, so it does not put any kind of a limit on the time or the space. So across national borders, across time periods, across languages, across genres, across boundaries. And even there is multidisciplinary approach, there is interdisciplinary approach with regard to comparative literature. And that is where the range is quite vast. I feel you can explore a lot when it comes to comparative studies. And they also say that there is no boundary. You can cross boundaries from literature. You can go on to music, painting, dance, and film, and etc. Okay, and we know that several plays and novels have been adapted. Okay, we have movie adaptations of several plays. Recently, I watched Anna Karenina. I watched Tennessee Williams' play, A Streetcar Named Desire. We can make a comparative study there. It's very much possible. So how it is presented in the movie and how it is in the original text. And we have Harry Potter. When it comes to children's literature, we have movies and how it is different from the book. Okay, so that way comparisons can be made. And we also have a good interplay of other studies, other fields of study. For example, we have a lot of psychology coming in. So definitely we always, literature, as literature students, we make a lot of reference to Freudian psychology or Jungian psychology when we study characters. So a good interplay of psychology, philosophy, science, history, architecture, anything, name any field of study that can be applied to literature. And that is why they say in a simple phrase that it is a study of literature without walls, or some even say literature without borders. So you can understand how much of scope is there for comparative literature. So when it comes to comparative literature studies, as researchers, as future scholars and researchers, I want to assert that comparative studies, they offer a very fertile ground to explore. There's such a lot that can be explored. It can be multidisciplinary, it can be interdisciplinary. You can bring in film, music, media, anything. And I was very much intrigued by the way that even uh, like graphic representations, they are also considered literature now. Just from a refresher course, I picked up a few things. Okay, how literature has been understood differently, new approaches to literature. It is not just the traditional text that they talk about now. Anything becomes literature, even a graphic representation. And they also talk about digital journalism, and even our WhatsApp messages or whatever, that can be taken up for study. And digital chats and digital journalism, all that can be taken up for study. So there is a lot of scope with regard to comparative literature that way. And when it comes to comparative literature, I was able to say a few things, a few aspects, but there is also another dimension to it. You can have comparative mythology and comparative linguistics. We have comparative grammar. So when it comes to comparative mythology, we know that Hindu mythology and Greek mythology, they have a lot of commonalities. And that is how I started actually my research. I started with the comparative mythology, but I had to narrow down my topic and restrict myself to the two epics, which are embodiments of that mythology. And definitely they are reflective of the culture and the society. So that is how it branches out. So even though you just start with a very broad topic, you may have to narrow down to any particular text or author. And comparison need not be across languages, even within the same languages which are spoken all over the world. For example, English. You can compare American literature with Australian literature or anything of that kind. So within India, within Tamil literature itself, you can compare two different authors. So even that is possible. It's not that literatures of two different languages must be compared. So there is a possibility that within the same language, two different authors can be compared. So even if the same language is spoken by different parts of the world, even that can be taken up for comparison. And we have comparative linguistics. Definitely, those who are interested in linguistics and ELT will be able to dwell upon this particular topic. And there is also comparative grammar, traditional grammar and modern grammar, and comparative sociology, comparative culture. When it comes to comparative culture and comparative literature and culture, I always think of Stephen Totosky, who is a critic, and he was the editor of CLC Web, Purdue University. He has produced excellent books. He's a very good critic. You can always refer to him. And as mentioned maybe a little earlier, you can have applications taking principles from literary history. That is what Elec and Warren actually say when they talk about comparative literature. Literary history offers a lot, okay? And because you are studying something across time, so literary history also will come in. So sociology, because it talks about culture and society, anthropology, the study of mankind, cultural history, psychology, all this will definitely come into play when we try to. But you can narrow down. It's not that you have to bring in everything. These are the aspects which may be brought in, but it all depends on the kind of topic that you're going to choose and work on. And I would like to quote Susan Bassnett here. She says, whatever it is, whenever we study a particular writer or text, unconsciously we compare. For example, when I was reading or teaching Tennessee Williams, I thought of Brecht. Okay, like I've not read the plays of Brecht. I'm quite familiar with the epic theater. He introduced epic theater, but he gave a lot of importance to a different kind of a technique. So that immediately strikes a bell. So as students of literature, we should always keep this in mind. What can be taken up for research or even for a paper presentation or even for a study. So you can make a comparison of Tennessee Williams and Brecht. And recently, I actually prepared a paper on Ahalya's character. See how it is presented in Ramayana, Valmiki's Ramayana, and Pudmai Pittan's short story. He has written a short story on Ahalya's character. So either any way, so it opens up, it should strike a bell ultimately. So whenever we study a work of art, it should strike, okay, something should trigger that spark, okay, this thing can be compared. So when we study more and more, we will try to come to that level of approach. Okay, that is quite possible. And Susan Bassett, that's what she says. Most people do not start with comparative literature. We may not start with comparative literature, but they end up with it some way or the other, and traveling towards it from different points of departure. Ultimately, you can't be without referring to anybody. Suppose you're dealing with Tennessee Williams, you can't help referring to other plays of Tennessee Williams. You cannot help referring to other plays of his contemporaries. It happens, okay, coincidence by coincidence or unconsciously, we tend to compare, and that is how it leads to better understanding of a particular writer. So that is what I wanted to just assert. And once again, the last PPT, last slide of my PPT, it is just a summing up of a quick recap of what we saw. So comparative literature is an academic field dealing with the literature of two or more different linguistic, cultural, or nation groups. And comparative literature can be performed on the works of the same language. Okay, same language belonging to different parts of the world, you can still work on that. Or within the same country, if you have different languages, you can compare. Or the same writer, you can compare two different books or more than that. Okay, so any number of uh, uh, texts can be taken for comparative study. And it also includes a wide range of inquiry to study the relationship between film and literature. Nowadays, that is the buzzword, isn't it? Film adaptations of literary works. So people do a lot of study on that. Okay, and it is basically intercultural and transnational. And any sphere of human activity, any field of knowledge can be brought into comparative literature. So I just wanted to give this as a kind of introduction to students who may not have studied comparative literature as a paper in their curriculum. So this is just an eye opener to the area, which will, if they approach it, they'll be able to get some ideas and start their research in this particular field. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Urmila, for this very crisp and very detailed the thinking about the discipline department. Particularly, she was very clear, and in the sense that it is to introduce, but also tell what can be done, right, in the field of research, and particularly also it had a research intent. So I think some of the very major points that she is taking up is within conventional unilingual, monolingual literature departments, what can comparative literature as a mode of inquiry? That's the first part. I think she wonderfully opened up. And therefore there are discussions about origins and so on and so forth, right? The origins and ideals of comparative literature, and which she actually very wonderfully set up. That's one part. The second part was also to do about mode of inquiry, right? So what is comparative, right? About there are literatures, what is comparative? I think the significant part of her presentation was also to do open up, think about, what can be done, how can it be done, or so on and so forth. So one of the things that probably I'm sure when it comes to the Indian case, why becomes a major question point, and Professor Dr. Urmila actually opened up that same thing. It started in the West and it went to the East, and what can we do? So I think she set up a wonderful backdrop to the presentation, to the inquiry, particularly to young scholars, students, to open up. There are quite a lot of things which can come up as questions and doubts, as clarifications. But before that, we have Dr. Merin from MCC. So over to Merin Wilson on thinking about build on, extend, but also critically, kind of, exchange ideas about comparative literature in India. Over to Dr. Merin.
Thank
And
you,
thank you,
Dr.
Dr.
Dickens. Thank you, Dr. Dickens. A big thank you to Urmila ma'am for introducing the field of comparative literature to the students, and also she has prepared such a framework that I can extend a lot of thoughts, of my thoughts into it. A big thank you. I'll also like to thank Dr. Rufus, Dr. Maria Preethi ma'am, and to the organizers of this wonderful symposium for giving us such a platform to share our thoughts and exchange ideas about such an interesting field. Let me clarify that I'm not a doctor. Comparative literature is one of my many research areas which I'm deeply interested in. And I just thought I'll give you some pointers to the students who are interested and who like to, as Urmila ma'am said, like to begin research in this field. So, as already mentioned, I'll be briefly looking at comparative literature in the context of Indian literatures. And I'll also be briefly discussing the growth and status quo of comparative literature in India, linking it to the growth of cultural studies. Because I'm using my mobile, my laptop is not working. I'll be switching off my camera because it becomes difficult for me to hold everything all together and speak. Okay. So there are many definitions of comparative literature, but I think the simplest one is what Urmila ma'am has already said, that it is simply the study of literature without any borders, without any borders of language, without any borders of nations, without any borders of cultures, time, or even disciplines. Okay, so as she has already told us the scope of comparative literature, it becomes easier for us to understand what goes into it. So I'll just look at two quotes. One is by a stalwart of Indian comparative studies in India, that is Sisir Kumar Das. He is the author. He was author and professor of many known works, and he was also the serving president of Comparative Literature Association of India till his death. So he has said that the very structure of Indian literature is comparative, which is true, right? And the second quote is by Dr. Radhakrishnan, which he said in 1905, and which is also the motto of Sahitya Academy, which is that Indian literature is one, though written in many languages. So it's very clear to us as Indian readers and Indian students that in Europe, comparative literature might be a matter of choice. But in India, from ages, it has always been a matter of necessity, right? Because uh, in such a multicultural, multilingual society like ours, it's very difficult to stick to your own culture or read or know only one language. While it is exceptional in Western societies to know more than one languages, in India it is exceptional to know only one language. Unfortunately, I'm in a situation where I can converse in three languages, but I can read literature properly only in one language. I'm sure many of you students are fortunate enough to have got an upbringing where you read literatures in different languages, at least two languages. So I encourage you to do that, and I encourage you to think about the points which are given to you here and read more about. Lots of information is available on the internet. There are other courses, SWAYAM courses, NPTEL courses that you can take. And uh, when you begin your research, these points might be useful to you. So, as you know, world literature and comparative literature had a joint beginning and was first used by the German thinker Goethe in Germany for the first time, world literature. And But in India, Tagore had been already talking about Vishwa Sahitya, and it is not simply a superficial um, uh, inclusion of my writing and your writing and his writing all together, as he mentioned, but it is a considerate and conscious inclusion of the other that we speak about in post-colonial studies. So he wanted all perspectives to be considered in world literature and comparative literature. But because we were under the colonial rule, it took us a lot of time from the time of Tagore to have a first Department of Culture, Comparative Literature, as Urmila ma'am mentioned, in Jadavpur University in the 1950s. And then another stalwart of comparative studies, R.K. Dasgupta, he started PG courses, MA and MPhil courses in comparative Indian literature, not simply comparative literature, in 1964 in the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi. Thus, he provided us with a comparative framework for research. And uh, Today, the current situation is that there are about 25 full comparative literature departments in about 600 universities. But papers are offered in almost every college and universities. Uh, there have been critics of comparative literature now also, areas of area studies, so sorry, new research areas like area studies, comparative cultural studies, influence studies, all of them threaten to overwhelm comparative literature. But I think the allure of comparative literature will still remain. So, what all does comparative literature actually involve? So if I just read out the list of things, I thought you'll get a bit bored. So I thought I'll illustrate this with a very small example. Now, as Urmila ma'am mentioned, like you can have comparative linguistics, you can have comparative grammar. Most of us are used to doing comparative readings of movies, because we have so many inspired versions of Hollywood movies. We again, it's an Indian innate quality of comparing epics, because epics have so many versions in so many regions of India that we usually do a comparative study. So here I just wanted to give you a small example of two small short stories. One is by famous Malayalam writer M.T. Vasudevan Nair, Karkidagam, which is, for those of you who know Malayalam, it is the name of the monsoon season, where you have unusually ferocious rains, and it makes you very cold and hungry at the same time. And we have another short story by the Tamil author, Vannan Ilavan. It's translated to jackfruit, originally titled Pallapara. So, in Karkadagam, what happens is that we are introduced to this protagonist, who's a very young, growing boy of young age. He's in the seventh standard. He feels that he's very old and mature, but we as reader understand that he's at a very poignant age. And the season of Karkadam has started, and due to the socio-economic conditions of India during those times, and due to his family situations, there's not much food in his family, in his home. So when he goes to school, he usually is hungry, but he can endure that. It is during noon when his classmates bring lunches or go home for lunches that he gets hungry. And to be hungry at the age of 12 and 13 is really sad. So he says how he endures those pangs of starvation by drinking water, and he's looking forward to his very frugal meal of kanni, which is rice water, some bits of rice and rice water. So on the way back home, he's dreaming about this dinner and how he can finally sleep peacefully. But what happens is, one distant relative of his father is working abroad, as many Malayali men do, and the entire joint family is surviving on his meager salary. So some distant relative of his father comes home, and because he's a guest, and we have this tradition of treating a guest like a god, and especially because the family pride has to be salvaged, what happens is, whatever little food was there in their house and the neighboring houses, all of them are scraped, and the guest gets a mound of steaming rice with papadam and coconut chutney and plantain curry, bulb curry, while the rest of them starve. Especially for this young boy to see all of these plenty. For us, it's not. For him, it's an extravagant meal. And how he almost faints, and he looks longingly at the rice water which they had once kept for him, and how he finally passes out due to hunger. So that story, I would like to compare it with another story by 111, where again you have a very vulnerable protagonist. But here the protagonist is a pregnant woman, and she is talking to her husband. Here again the background is pretty pathetic. They don't have much money. The husband does have a job, but he cannot get a salary because of a strike going on in his factory. So he doesn't have much money to make his wife go to a doctor or to give her nutritious food, leave alone nutritious food, not food itself. So they can hear everything which goes on in the neighbor's house because they live in a very small hut. And there we hear the visual that we have is of this hungry couple discussing what to do next. And in the next room, you have a group of young children who are fighting for some pieces of jackfruit. So the smell of the jackfruit comes in, and the children are fighting, and the frustrated mother, she's screaming at them. And the husband promises the young wife that somehow I'll borrow money from my friends and I'll take you to the doctor and we'll order some dinner. I'll get some idlis from some hotel. That is what they're dreaming about. But and the young woman also sort of hopes that the jackfruit would be sent from the other house because the smell is so tempting. But even though they come to invite her to the temple, they don't give her the jackfruit. And in the evening, when the husband comes home, he has nothing in his hands. And he has his dinner with his head bent down, not even looking at his wife. And we surmise that the wife has not eaten anything because she lays down on the floor and goes to sleep. So both the stories, when you read it, it seems as if they were written with a determination to make us cry and look at the similarities and dissimilarities between them. But as Urmila ma'am talked about, it's not only about the similarities and dissimilarities. We also ask about the why and how of how these stories can be compared. So what do? You look at the influences that the writers might have when they wrote the story. One comes from the tradition of Malayalam writers, one comes from the tradition of Tamil writings. You look at the socio-economic factors, you look at the time period, you look at the cultural factors which might have unified them or the similarities between them. You look at the theme of kinship, kinship between family members, and in the next story it is kinship between neighbors who have a common struggle. So when I list down these points with which you can, where comparative literature gives us a methodology, please think about these two stories so that you understand how you can practically do analysis. Why world literature and comparative literature, both of them came together as a concept. In reality, what happens is that world literature is a collection of literary masterpieces from different cultures and literatures, while comparative literature became a methodology on how to study world literature. So what does the methodology comprise of? It has, you can study the themes, you can have a comparative study of themes, think about the story, it is called thaumatology. You can have a comparative study of the literary forms, which is called genealogy. You can have a comparative study of reception. Now, it started out as comparative study of influence. So you look at the influence that the writer might have had when he wrote the story. So you look at the background, what text did he read, what were his literary influences, with whom, which writers did he correspond to, what might be the cultural influences and all of that. Basically a biographical study. But after some time, it was understood that the influencee is much more important than the influencer. The person who is influenced, how receptive he is to the influences around him is very important. Which is why the comparative study of reception of influence is now known as a comparative study of reception. Okay, so we can do a comparative study of the writers, comparative study of different literary traditions by putting them together. So you look at Malayalam literature and Tamil literature and look at the similarities and dissimilarities and all of that. So what comparative literature does is gives us a wider perspective and a more Catholic attitude towards several literatures together. So at the end of it, you know a lot more about Tamil literature and Malayalam literature. You also do a focus study of two literary traditions and advanced skills in a second language. So chances are that one is your mother tongue. So probably you might have advanced skills in that particular language. So that also improves because of the study. Then you look at texts from a range of cultural contexts. What were the social economic factors which made poverty so common? And what is it that made people not rebel back? Historical periods, literary movements, etc. It also asks complex questions of comparison, translation, and transmission through cultural, linguistic, and national boundaries, where the writers influenced by each other. For example, another example that I can give you is the concept of civil rights, which civil disobedience, which Mahatma Gandhi introduced to us, which was actually taken by Thoreau, which again was originally taken from India, and then it went to America, then it went to London, and then Mahatma Gandhi finally returned that concept back to India through his writings. Other examples of doing a comparative study might be looking at Robert Frost, the American poet, looking at his poems through the context of, let's say, Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy. So you look at his poems in a different light altogether. So those were some pointers that I thought you might enjoy. Now, there are critics of comparative literature who believe that this is a very limited way of looking at text, and it sort of uh, uh, puts down one literature instead of throwing light on both the literature together. Um, uh, Gayatri Spivak has also commented on comparative literature, and there's an essay that she wrote, Rethinking Comparativism, where she laments this depth of a discipline due to translation. Again, as Urmila ma'am mentioned, when you read two forms in two different languages, you understand more about two different cultures. But when so for in some contexts, the only way it can happen is if you have translations. Like I don't know German, so if I want to contrast a German story with the Indian story, the only way I can do it is through translations. But due to translations, is I'm no longer making an effort to learn German language or learn more about German culture. So according to Spivak, the depth of a discipline has occurred due to growing translations. And one of our uh, very famous writers who has always advocated comparative literature is U.R. Anandamurthy, who had always questioned why vernacular Indian literature texts so rarely receive the kind of careful attention that critics give to major texts in Europe and American literature. And he has always asked students to do textual comparisons and look at the cultural and social influences that run through Indian literary texts. So I don't know how far we are doing that right now. I'll very briefly, because lack of time, look at the connection between cultural studies and comparative literature. So as you know, cultural studies does not look only at literary texts. It considers any cultural production to be worthy of attention. There's no high literature, low literature, and it is considered to be, cultural studies is considered to be the political corrective to Eurocentric comparative literature. So why I joined both of them together is, you know, that comparative literature internationally, it really took steam in the 1960s when it became interdisciplinary. And that was also the time when you had feminism, post-colonialism, all of them all influencing each other. So during this time, the scope of comparative literature was widened by cultural studies. And it also was influenced by this way of looking at text as products to be consumed and looking at readers as consumers. Um, so cultural studies, as you know, the basis of that is the concept of culture that Arnold and Lewis had, where they believe that culture is the epitome of civilization, and how you have high culture, which is the best of civilization. So cultural studies, of course, broke away from that, and before the postmodern turn came, it had a lot of political potential, and it was seen as an agent of social change. So that is when comparative literature also began to come up, and both of them did influence each other, especially in India. And it was recognized that the marginalized, through the study of cultural studies, can use culture to stake their claim. And that has also benefited comparative literature. Now, as I've said, nowadays area studies is gaining a lot of momentum, which is basically concentrating on researching on particular geographical regions or cultural regions, including diaspora and immigration also, which usually cultural studies does not do. And there is this new field called comparative cultural studies, which sort of merges the best of comparative studies and cultural studies. And the objective is to study culture and cultural products, and recognize that they are shaped and they shape current global developments. Any current global developments. It can be digitization of culture, it can be the current pandemic, it can be virtual reality, it can be environmental degradation, anything. Um, Another area that is coming up, which is giving competition to comparative studies, influence studies, where the influence of a writer is examined. So I think I might have exceeded my time limit. So these are the points that I had written down. If you have any thoughts to share, please do that in the space which is given to you. Thank you so much for your patient listening. I hope I have not confused you with a lot of points put all together. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Merin, for this very comprehensive intervention into thinking about doing comparative literature in India. And very interestingly, as most of the scholars who introduce the discipline is via these early conversations, 19th century conversations of Goethe with Eckermann, conversations of wealth literature, as they call. And you very interestingly brought in Tagore's Vishwa Sahitya, and then opened up this conversation towards the interlinks between world literature and the discipline of comparative literature. And it's a very interesting thing because you have this discipline actually organizing itself across time with its state of the discipline reports from say 1950s onwards. You have every 10 years the state of the discipline report, and interestingly the 2017 report, that's every report was until then a book. 2017 went online, where actually practicing comparators can actually bring in their own ideas. You should have a check. It's called the State of the Discipline Report 2017. Everybody who's interested, please do. They're going digital. What is the digital? The role of the digital in thinking. And there's a kind of a people's project. Yeah, people's project into the thinking. So it was also a very interesting presentation because to give an example, Merin also brought in two stories, one in Tamil and one in Malayalam, two short stories to give the example of, say, how do you look at genre, say short stories, but also how do you look at themes, but how do you look at writers, of a particular group, and how do you also look at writing within a particular language. So she was telling I could only do one language, and I think it's true for almost most of the Indians. I mean, everyone would be located in their own first language that they acquire, or sometimes two languages, but also everyone is trained into a certain kind of common language, be it Hindi or English, and so on and so forth. So it's a very peculiar, distinctive post-colonial phenomenon as well, and that's why you have this discipline also when you open up to think in India. Post-colonialism comes, vernaculars comes, multilingualism comes, and so on. And particularly when you have huge departments, monolingual departments like English, or vernacular departments, monolingual departments across. There's the liminal space in which the discipline itself finds in its criticality, right? This is a critical, and that's why you have many of these people critiquing comparators, and they are themselves comparatists. Spivak is a comparatist, right? You have Edward Said, a comparatist. Who's talking about post-colonialism. You have most of the very Baba is a comparatist. Is located in comparative literacy department in the US. So you have a very interesting story from Europe, but also from US, and then it gets transposed from Bangla, in Bangla, in India. So that I'm glad that she brought in and also brought in the South Indian example of doing this, right? So she ended up with area studies, diaspora and culture, and kind of opened up textualities. And I think with the question of textualities, what is text and culture studies, right? So, and how do you do a comparative mode as a kind of calling to thinking? So one wonders, right? From the two presentations, it's a kind of an expansive reach, and therefore there's no limit, and where does a discipline end and start? Everything is comparative. But when you do something like I think Dr. Merin is sorry, Dr. Maria is actually waiting for a long time to bring this. How do you do when you do text? And I think with this kind of opening of taking a Dalit literary text from the Marathi context translated to English, take an Australian Aboriginal text taken from another context, and then bring in and say, what is this study? How can a study be done? I think for that, let us invite Dr. Maria to extend this, particularly to see how this works out, right, as a research ad, right? While both of them had told about this whole disciplinary introductions and such, right? I mean, invite Dr. Maria to set in the detailed analysis of how do you do this in this context. Over to Maria. Thank you. Thank you, Merin. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Dickens. Thank you, Merin. Thank you, Urmila. And you kind of, brought a very thought-provoking ideas across. And thank you, Urmila, for talking about influences, about imitation. And I think what I have to present will probably illustrate all this imitation, influences, borrowing, and which could be also called appropriation. And Merin touched on the death of a discipline. So I was reminded of an article written by Professor C.T. Indra on multiculturalism and planetarity, which is in this book, which was brought out by our department in 2018. We had our conference in 2014. So I'd just like to read out what is written about planetarity. Spivak's ideas of planetarity. So she says, we don't use the word global because of its associations with capitalism and Western capitalism, but we use planetarity. And it's about this planetarity is about collectivities whose existence have not been so far even recognized by the existing world order. So these collectivities cross borders under the auspices of a comparative literature supplemented by area studies. They might attempt to figure themselves, imagine themselves as planetarity rather than continental, global, or worldly. So Spivak proposes the planet to overwrite the globe. Well, this it might be a bit high sounding for students, but what I was drawn to was the idea of collectivities. Okay, collectivities and the subjectivities that are there in different parts of the globe. So you have Australian Aboriginal in the South Pacific, and you have the Indian subcontinent where you have the Dalit experience. It's you have the Indian Ocean, and it's geographically so distanced. But then you have these intersections, and as Urmila said, it's about similarities and differences. And earlier, when I set out on this research, I was not conscious of it being, into comparative literature, comparative studies. And so the word I used at that time was transnational studies. So I'll just share a bit about a few thoughts that I had put together for today. So I share a window, right? Or full screen?
Nothing actually. We are only seeing you.
No. Nancy, can you share my PPT? Okay. Yeah. So I just want to draw your attention to a couple of life stories, and the first one is Kumud Paude's Antas Fort, from which you have this, in which you have the story of my Sanskrit, and that appears in this collection called Poison Bread. So Dalit Marathi Dalit literature, and in this next slide, she talks about the previous slide. She talks about how she got to learn Sanskrit. She was a lower caste girl belonging to a Mahar community, and the very idea of learning Sanskrit was, beyond the pale of her experience, and so there were three kind of responses. So there are people in her community who were they accepted the idea and they felt that it was uh, an achievement for someone from the community. And on the other hand, she had people from the upper caste who looked down on her or rejected her. They thought that she was aspiring for something beyond her her means, beyond her what she was, what society uh, had had given to her, had in mind for her, had what society had circumscribed for her. And then the third group of people is her students, who listened to her with a lot of admiration. Next. Then she had this school teacher who was very benevolent, and she expressed to him her desire to learn Sanskrit. And he asked her why she wouldn't choose to be a doctor, because in that case she could help her community. But she said that she had this fascination for this very musical language, and the chants and all these things really fascinated her, and so she wanted to study Sanskrit. And then her next teacher was a Brahmin teacher named Gokhale. His name was Gokhale, her Guruji. And she refers to him as a broad-minded person, a person who encouraged her, who accepted her, who didn't discriminate against her. And then when she went on to do her MA, she had this very a modern-looking professor who who appeared to be modern, whose articulation, whose behavior, everything was in sync with modernity. But she could read between the lines and see that he was very prejudiced. So, so this kind of, her experience was about acceptance, rejection. That kind of dichotomy was there all along. And that experience of that kind of swimming against the tide. And the story is dated, it's in the 60s. She was born in 1938, so you can quite imagine what caste discrimination was at that time. And she talks about how after having completed her education, she next slide, she tried for a job and she was on the shelf for 2 years. So then she wrote to Jagjeevan Ram, the minister in the central government, who in turn put her request before Pandit Nehru, and then it went to the state government. And with all that rigmarole, she was still not given a job. because she was not deemed fit to teach Sanskrit. And in this whole journey, we see that social acceptance was the main barrier for her. Now, well, what is we have need to think about why she wanted to learn Sanskrit. Probably the whole challenge of defying society, of entering into a realm which was considered off limits for a Dalit person. And and she also mentions in her narrative about hearing the voice of encouragement from her father saying that you can do it. Okay. It is learning Sanskrit is not off limits for Dalit people. You can learn Sanskrit. And she also heard the voice of, pioneering Dalit activists Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule, encouraging her to carry on and pursue this dream of learning Sanskrit. So, in other words, she wanted to break the glass ceiling. She wanted to really do that, break the glass ceiling for her as a woman and for her as more so as a Dalit woman. Now, I was when I in this search for what helps a person from an oppressed community gain a voice. Education seemed to be one of the answers to me, and that is why when I read these narratives, I found that activism and education enabled them. They provided agency. And here in the Australian experience, next slide, reading through some Australian life stories. Now, this story is by Sally Dingo. The story of our mob is about Sally marrying Ernie Dingo, an Aboriginal man who was a very leading theatre person at that time. But one of the things that I picked up from this narrative is about a person named Les Dingo who worked on these stations, you know. And so, these stations where people were the sheep rearing stations, where the boss was a white man and he had sheep and he had Aboriginal workmen. So they're basically the stockmen who worked on the sheep farms. And so here, Les Dingo, he is illiterate, but he learns. His literacy begins by reading the labels on jam tins and soup tins. So on the tin, if he can, when he looks at the label, he knows that okay, soup is spelled as SOUP, and jam should be, if this is a jam tin, this must be JAM. So that was the beginning of literacy for him, and he pursued that. Okay, he pursued that and got to be able to read more. And a similar experience is recorded even by Alice Nannup in When the Pelican Laughed. Next. Yeah. So she also was working as a domestic, facing oppression, ill treatment, discrimination. And she also talks about learning to read through all these labels while reading the labels. Next. So here's this book, Writing Never Arrives Naked, which threw a lot of light on the idea of acquiring language. And Bill Ashcroft has, given us that idea of the empire writing back. But the language through which you write back, paradoxically, is the language of the colonizer or the language of the oppressor. And acquiring that language, could it be considered empowerment, or is it due to sheer force of circumstance? Well, this title, Writing Never Arrives Naked, itself, tells about how it has been a process. It has been a process of acquisition. And in this book, she talks about how people who lived on the reserves had to write letters to the superintendents of the reserves if they had to leave the reserve. So actually, Aboriginal people's movement was restricted by the by an act called the Sale of Opium Act. Well, under the pretext that keeping people within the reserves would protect them from being exposed to drugs and narcotics. So they were kept within their reserves. And if they had to move out of their reserves to meet relations who lived, probably close by and even could be on a walkabout. Walkabout would mean people, they went walking. So walkabout was part of Aboriginal culture where they would move around to meet their people in different places. So they always had this desire to go for walkabout, but whenever they wanted to go for their walkabout, they had to seek permission from the superintendent. So they wrote letters. All right, they were expected to write letters, the way students write letters to the hostel warden, asking for permission to go home. A similar thing, and then petitions. All right. Now, she says that, well, this kind of writing in English alone need not be considered literacy. Next slide. She has this drawing of Wurjadi clubs that the Wurjadi people use. So you can see the signification system over there. So you know that Aboriginal art um, is a very deep form of signification. So a lot of on all those drawings mean something, and these inscriptions on these Wurjadi clubs could be considered literacy. So, and she refers to this as other literacies. And next slide. Yeah. So, and in 1963, when the Urmila people, they wanted to protest against the mining that was being done in the area. See, mining is not just exploitation of land resources. It means white people come into the community and they leave. They breed half-caste children. All right, and then they come into the community. They bring alcohol with them. And Aboriginal people don't have a native alcohol like we have toddy. Okay, so now with this bauxite mining, there is not only exploitation of resources, there's no compensation for the people who live in that area, and there's intrusion into their territory. So the Yirkala people, they presented their petition on bark, but of course you can see it is typed and it is pasted onto this bark, but it's a representation. One of the words that I often use when I write about literacy is the word inscription. Okay, so when you take a pen and write, it is an inscription. And if you inscribe on bark, it's an inscription. And then I did travel in Carnarvon Gorge, where I did see a lot of inscriptions on caves. It was actually a huge graveyard. I'm sorry I didn't present photographs. A huge graveyard. So the inscriptions there were about people who had died. Okay, so if there's a inscription like this, it means the youngest child in the family they've lost the youngest child. That's what the ranger told me. Now, so here you have the bark petition, very symbolic. Next. And coming to a text with this Whispers of this Wick Woman by Fiona Doyle, an autobiography. I found it very interesting because this text is all about, has a lot to say about gaining a voice through education. And what is education? Yes, it's the mainstream education, school education, university education. Now, Fiona Doyle is a performer, okay, and she's a theatre person, a dancer, and she decided to write her grandmother's story. And her grandmother's story is about how her grandmother didn't receive the compensation that she had to receive uh, from the bauxite mining company, which was mining bauxite on this place called Weipa. Okay, so Weipa is up there in near the Gulf of Carpentaria. It's along the coastline there, and well, so they had this kind of politics within the community where Avampan, her grandmother, the lady you can see on the cover, is regarded as an outsider. And she she sort of, though she had crossed the Embley River and come to live in Weipa, and she had crossed the Embley River and come to live here as a bride, and then lived there with her husband and had children, grandchildren. Yet, when it came to compensation, she was regarded as an outsider because originally her place was in Orukun, the other side of the river. And so, as a little girl, Fiona has seen her grandmother going through this trauma about being rejected by her own people, and all the white anthropologists coming in and taking down notes about about native titles. So there's something about this native title is something that the government gives in recognition of them being the traditional owners of the land. Okay, so there's a difference between land rights and native title. So native title is about your cultural affiliation to the land. So having to prove her identity time and again was very traumatic for this lady. Now come to our deliberations on education and literacy. Fiona wanted to tell her Nana's story, and in the process, she's also told her own story. The next slide. So this is her Nana, Avampan. And next slide. So that's Fiona in the middle. So Fiona with her Nana. And the person on the right is Stephanie, her English teacher at school. So you can see Fiona is light-skinned. So she is the product of an interracial union. I won't say marriage because she's her father made her mother pregnant, and she never saw her father in her life till she was 27 years old, and she went looking for her father. Now her father was a person who came to work in this bauxite company in Weipa, and then she was always felt this kind of discrimination amongst the dark-skinned children in Weipa. They would call her a bastard child. So she always heard that. She felt she was teased, she was ridiculed, scorned. And so she did a one-woman show, being a theatre person. She did a one-woman show called A Bastard's Tale. Now, in this book, Whispers of this Wick Woman, there are passages where she narrates in home language, in Creole, okay? And that's very difficult for us to read or even comprehend, but she's deliberately kept those passages there. And in this story, she talks at one point about her grandmother giving her a typewriter. And when I interviewed her also, she was very emotional about that part of it. And she says, when I graduated, my grandmother gave me a typewriter. And then when I look back, it's that my grandmother wanted me to be empowered the white man's way. And interestingly, she uses the word appropriation. So in our post-colonial studies, we come across the word appropriation in the context of no, not only of course, in post-colonial studies, we've come across it in terms of we appropriating their language. And in Aboriginal studies, we come across the term appropriation in terms of white society appropriating Aboriginal art and culture for their capitalist purposes. For example, there was some controversy about the Fanta, what is that Coca-Cola thing, which the orange dots claiming that's an Aboriginal design, and also about Qantas using Aboriginal art in their promotions. So that there they talk about white people appropriating Aboriginal art, but she uses the word appropriation in the context of appropriating English. So she says that she has appropriated English and made it her own, and she has let her voice travel through English. Well, she distinguishes between home language and standard English. So home language is a kind of pidgin or Creole that they speak in that coastal community. And standard English is what she acquired through her leaving the community, leaving Weeper and going to Sydney and going to the School of Drama there and doing a graduate program there, and learning to write in standard English. Now, this learning to write in standard English was something that her teacher Stephanie helped her to do. Stephanie, the lady in the picture. Stephanie was her school teacher, and with Stephanie, she had shared her dream of wanting to express herself in writing. So it was Stephanie who told her to write her grandmother's story. So from the time she was 16 or 17, or even younger than that, she has been writing her grandmother's story and different versions of it, with different drafts of it. And and then her manuscript went to the prestigious David Unipon selection committee for the Aboriginal Arts Council Prize or something like that, a very prestigious prize, the David Unipon Prize. And the committee decided that her manuscript had potential. Well, the prize was not given to her, but they asked her to rework and resubmit. All right. So with that, her manuscript got more leverage and her book got published. So I did speak to members of the committee also who gave her suggestions about improving her manuscript. So you see this journey is there from speaking home language, then an English teacher taking interest in her, telling her to write her story, learning to use a typewriter, and leaving Weeper and going to a metropolitan center where she hears people speak standard English and she tries to write and speak in standard English. And then she is able to function in both cultures, in her own community at Weeper and also in a kind of cross-cultural context. She's able to interact with other Australians and also in English with people from other countries as well, as she interacted with me. So next slide. Now, what has engaged my mind for this evening is the idea of other literacies, of literacy, of other literacies, like the Bark petition. No, Bark petition was of course typed, like the inscriptions on caves, like the inscription on bark, like the inscription on the Wurjadi clubs, or inscriptions on boomerangs, and also the idea of language, other languages. Okay, now obviously every learning a language begins with literacy. We talk about computer literacy. So you talk about getting literacy in Tamil or Telugu or whatever, and then you're not just literate, you acquire fluency, and after fluency, you go to proficiency. So now when you look at other literacies, you and Merin was talking about cultural products, okay, which cultural studies talks about. You could talk about any cultural production now, okay, and there are different texts. A film is a text, a painting is a text. So these are all texts. These cave inscriptions, these paintings are texts. And interestingly, on my visit to one of the reserves in Queensland, well, you had the whole colonial past over there. You had the dormitory. You had you could see how the ladies were taught tailoring and all the home crafts and all that. And there's an abattoir for the slaughter of cows and for the beef to be processed. But all that is dormant. Nothing over there. There's nothing taking place over there now. Nothing of the old order. But instead, there are a lot of Aboriginal painters painting. Okay. And when I reported this to another friend, they said, well, they are expressing themselves through their art now. It's so they don't want to continue. To me, it looked like, well, there's so much that a whole, setup is there, a whole society is there which functioned in so many years ago. Why can't they keep the abattoir going? But obviously, they're not interested. They are more interested. They are more interested in expressing themselves through painting. There are a lot of people painting in that reserve. That's at Murgon in Queensland. So now I'm sharing all these things because Fiona used one term. Because I told you, she's multifaceted. She has many talents. She dances. She writes poems. She performs as a theatre person. And so she said that it all depends. Her mode of expression depends on the season in her life. So there would be times, certain experiences she would bring out through dance. Some experiences she would bring out through painting. She was an artist as well. And there were some experiences she would bring out through, she has brought out through writing poems, writing her autobiography, writing stories. So, and even in we have the idea of multiple intelligences. I don't want to go too much into that. So even with, so multiple intelligences could make us think about multiple literacies and about multiple languages. So your language is not necessarily something that is there in print. There are different ways of inscribing the self. I seek your pardon if I was too self-indulgent and I didn't reach out, but I just, if you have any questions, you may ask me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Maria, for this very in-depth reflection on this phenomenon. Though the Dalit story was shortly, introduced, you went on to a very detailing of it with the Aboriginal writing, not writing, cultural expressions, if you want to call, inscriptions, as you have mentioned, and in fact, opening up the question of colonialism, print modernity, occupation, power, and cultural hegemony, and then look at the marginalized. Within the print history, they call lettered human beings, alphabetized human beings, and open up this regime of power, right? Regime of power in literacy. Thanks for opening this up. And one of the major crux with her presentation, I would take, is this interesting way in which a comparative kind of modes of locations, what one could call as entrenched inequalities and oppressions across the world. Feminism has taught us that, women writing across different regions, and what Dr. Maria opened up is to look at entrenched inequalities of cultures and people as such. And this is one, and this has been done with the Dalit movement and the Black African American Black movement, African cultures and Aboriginal cultures across the world, Aboriginal native cultures of India, Asia, and across the world, and so on and so forth. So this, she opened up a different paradigm to think and build on. Something to add on to on the Poday's work. There's quite a lot of interesting discussion that has happened within Indian writing itself. One of the major things was MSS Pandyan's work, One Step Outside Modernity, a short piece, very cult piece, where he actually compares R.K. Narayan and Poday's, writing, and very interestingly he brought in. And to build on this very interesting way of interlinking entrenched inequalities is also Isaac Komola's work, looking at different kind of inequalities. It's quite fascinating that you brought in this paradigm of thinking about comparative literatures with your presentation, building on the other two interesting interventions in thinking about comparative literature. I'm sure that a lot of questions, clarifications, but also comments, open to comments and thoughts. Any thought that you want to share? There are other scholars here, right? I opened the discussion for an engagement from the participants, right? And probably I'll have a kind of a short, kind of a conclusion at the end after the discussion, right? So over to the panelists. Before that, let me check if there are any questions here. So there are, yeah, appreciations to the presenters, but any questions, any clarifications? Even Tamil should go, I think, if people want to ask in Tamil. I think I can translate at least, but also I'm sure there'll be others be well aware. Yes, over to the participants.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, Sumati, yes.
Sir, I am Sumati from Chennai. I'd like to know, of course, all the three speakers gave a wider view about comparative literature, starting from the overview and about various aspects of comparative literature, and particularly how it should be illustrated. Everything is clearly that is expressed here, and I would like to know whether we can use any yardstick to estimate the text in the legacy of comparison. Is there any yardstick, any scale to measure the texts that we have taken for comparison, as it is said by Matthew Arnold, touchstone method, and so on? I would like to know about that. So,
can we take one or two questions more? Yeah, along with Shumati, then we can open up for the yeah, one or two questions more.
That is
Shumati, no, we got a question. I'm just opening up. If there is any more question, one or two questions more, then we can actually ask the presenters. All right, Shumati. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you, sir. Only this much, sir. Simply this one, sir. I have a simple question only this.
Okay, if there isn't any, probably let me ask the presenters to respond to this. Probably the first two presenters, specifically a disciplinary. Dr. Urmila, Dr. Merin.
Yes, like what I understand from the main tenet of comparative literature is that it's only a methodology or an approach to the study of a particular work of art. So that way, like there is no it's not a theory. So it is only an approach, and so we don't have any yardstick as such. We are not going to pronounce any kind of a judgment on any work of art. So this is only a tool to study for a better understanding of any work of art. So that is what
Then
Merin, would you like to say something? add to this?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. I think you have. I was thinking the same thought. I understand why Sumati must have asked the question because there's no like concrete uh,
Yeah.
terms or concrete way in which you can say that this is how you do comparative analysis. But which is why Matthew Arnold's touchstone method was so limiting and limited to some criteria, which is why uh, we have uh, we have fields like cultural studies and we have fields like comparative literature to analyze texts not in a limited manner at all. Like it depends, as Urmila ma'am already said, it depends upon the kind of text that you're taking, it depends upon the tradition that you're analyzing, it also depends upon many cultural factors. So there's no standard yardstick as such. Like you are looking at world literature. Like there's no limit. Like there are no borders to what can be analyzed and cannot be analyzed. So how can you ever have a yardstick? The entire notion of world literature and comparative literature came about because they wanted to fight against this notion of national literature. So even that they were against, that there should be no national literature, because we are looking at all kinds of literature, which is not limited to one kind of genre, one kind of concept. So, which is why we don't have a particular approach, a particular method like a touchstone method.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Urmila. Thank you so much.
But that's a very interesting question, Srimati, and I think they both of them have intervened into very interestingly. But also the question keeps. It is a question that has actually founded the discipline. Okay, the originally crisis. Yeah, crisis of origins, originally crisis. It is
Yes.
at the heart of the discipline because the discipline itself, as you would know, there was no discipline like comparative literature, right? So I mean, it is always something which is made, which is being made and made open. So there is a European story with from philology. You know, from philology was a discipline, right? So which was one singular language study, right? And then from there, when you want to do two different languages, the European way was to look at Latin and Greek as touchstone, and that's why you have Mati and all actually telling these are the classics to which we have to all write. All other vernaculars have to write. So all of the
Yes.
vernaculars were English, Italian, other language of Europe, right? So within Europe, the touchstone was Greek and Latin, right? So what happens is in the 19th century, compared to the departments gets. Can you just mute your thing? It's getting a yeah. Thank you. Sorry, yeah. So what happens in America, where the discipline is formed at the margins of different departments, right? And it happens in the context when the whole Jewish exodus is happening from Europe to America, right? Most of the philologists then become comparatives in America, right? In comparative departments in California, in New York, in all these departments in the US, right? You have then people actually getting jobs here, right? So for example, Rene Vellec, all these people shift to from Europe to, you have all the big names in the comparative tradition moving from Europe to US, right? And in the US, the multicultural kind of mood becomes a huge thing, where the learning was, what is we taught, what is the model is something else. So that's where this Merin's important thing about, what happens is a different kind of a model opens up in the US. Then within India, right, you have, it opens up, when it comes all the way, you have post-colonialism, I told multilingualism, you have culture, you have multicultural, you have the question of regional variances, but not only that, you have the official language policies, right? Why Pavde's Sanskrit becomes a major question mark, somebody presented it, right? So what happens here is, then what is a touchstone becomes a huge question. It's a question of power. She brought in the Australian example, right? It's a question of power. It's a question of which culture gets adapted, right, into scripts, the writing scripts, right? What is considered as literature, right? And what is accepted as literature, right? The whole disciplinary regime, Foucault, you all would have read, opens up. Question of caste, gender, right? The location of this culture, location of culture as power. All this opens up, and comparative literature seems very interesting. Today, you see in Delhi University, they removed 3 texts. right? Because of translation, because of feminist movements, because of Dalit movements, these texts became part of, right, teaching in Delhi University. You have Bama's text removed, you have Sugirta Rani's text removed, you have Draupadi's, sorry, Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi text removed. So it opens up a different paradigm to think about comparative literature, right? So what is the touchstone? Probably the touchstone be reason for them to be removed, right, from Delhi University. It's happening here, right here, right, in India, in English literature departments, right? So the question keeps continuing, and the question is much more significant and critical for people doing, literatures without opening of borders, opening up of power, opening up of knowledge. What is the idea of knowledge and so on? So your question is right there at the center of the discussion on what is comparative literature. So thank you for that, and thanks. Probably, yeah, probably Maria also, yeah, just intervened because the answers were really interesting, and yeah, Maria also can jump in, to.
Yeah, I kind of second what you're saying that there's no dogma now. That very title, no, Merin, the death of a discipline. Okay, that's one thing. And about how comparative literature was Eurocentric, with this idea of Goethe's idea of world literature. Actually, when they started this comparative literature, it was not about inclusion. It is about establishing what is best. Okay, but from there we have moved on to, having more inclusiveness, and it's a field that's evolving. So I think quite rightly there need not be a canon and any dogma about and because we have also the idea of text has changed, so there is no we should not I suppose we need not be worried too much about yardsticks, because yardsticks become lathis at one point of time. Thank you for the opportunity to
Any
respond.
more questions, guys, for the very brilliant presentation,
Good.
all three? Yeah.
May I, sir? Thank you so much. Good evening, sir. This is Srinivasan.
Yeah.
I was really impressed to know that imitation and influence is also a part of comparative literature. My question is, if inspirations could also become a constituency of comparative literature, then where does plagiarism stand? Standing in the shoes of a writer, how could a writer be conscious about drawing the borderline between plagiarism and drawing influence or inspiration?
I think this Maria should actually respond. Actually, it's about also the question about appropriation, right? So I think you must, and probably others as well. Yeah.
Sanyavel, could you just repeat that question, Ma?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I learned that inspiration, influences, and imitations are also part of comparative literature.
Oh,
And on that
okay.
sense, where do plagiarism stand, ma'am? Thinking from a writer's perspective, if I'm happy to draw inspirations or get ideas from other literatures and imparting them in my own writing, where would I be? How would I be so conscious that I'm not plagiarizing the works of great masters?
Well, beginning with Aristotle, we know that art is imitation, right? So, and we also construct reality. So, whatever you construct doesn't come out of a vacuum. It comes through influences. So, even if you write a poem, Senyavel, you may think it is your own, but there will be resonances with other texts. And so that is where we have this idea of intertextuality. So all texts are interconnected. So there are intersections between texts, and even the text that you create would probably, in your subconscious mind, you would have the influences of texts that you have read. So plagiarism is just lifting off without acknowledgement, and it's a copy paste. But an influence and an imitation is not plagiarism.
Yes, ma'am. It's
Can I also
clarifying.
respond here? Can I also respond to this
Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
question
yes.
of
Yes, ma'am.
Srinivasan? Yeah, like see, as asked by her, I feel that like with regard to creative work, there is no plagiarism. Maybe with regard to critical work or critical study, only the question of plagiarism comes. So when René Villach talks about influences or imitation, he clearly mentions that imitation is actually unconscious, conscious influence. It happens consciously. We get influenced by some predecessor who has written on a similar topic, and many times there are similarities. That is where the question of comparison itself comes. If there are no influences or imitations or affinities, there is no question of comparative study at all. So with regard to creative work, there is no question of plagiarism. Plagiarism is more to do with any critical study. Am I right?
Yes, yeah. And just one more thing, Senyavel, it's also about power structures. So don't you think there's such a high premium on learning English in our society, knowing English? So you must learn English, you must know English for upward mobility. So that kind of thing, yeah. So even these people who were in these reserves, they wanted to learn English, to be able to survive. It's a survival skill. And with regard to Sanskrit also, probably it was symbolic for her to say that she had acquired a language that she was denied access to. So it has to do with power equations in society.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was really eye-opening. Thank you, Dr. Urmila ma'am, and thank you, Dr. Preethi ma'am.
Any more questions? Clarifications? Comments? Okay, so that was really fascinating. If people are even thinking about, like, you can just share your message. But otherwise, it was really a very enlightening discussion. One I always enjoy, be part of, because of, as you all know, one of the things that you probably, many of us scholars, not to think comparative is something out there, something else. It's a certain kind of a practice of thought, practice of reading, and perhaps a practice of engaging with cultural expressions, if you want to put it in a limited way. So wherever you are, somebody asks about writing, creative writing, somebody asks about critical research, right? It's about a certain mode of engagement with cultural expressions which is out there. You have to integrate. If you're doing history, you do comparatively. If you're doing sociology, you do comparatively. If you're doing literary studies, you do comparatively, right? It's a method, as Dr. Urmila has mentioned, and it's a method also which needs a certain contextual, contingent. By contingent, I mean here and the now, right? So it's not that Europe has taught us what to do, US has taught us. It's happened before us, but also something which is happening here and the now. And I think for that we need to also take up, like Dr. Maria has mentioned, and Merin has brought in the Indian context, right? We also look at east, west, north, south, forward, backward, right? And take tools, right, from marginalized, or rather not so prioritized cultures that we have readily canonized and taught to read as touchstone, right? Throw the stone back, right, at these touchstones, and then figure out how we can touch everything, right? Touch everything, right? Touch everything. So with that kind of a thing, and probably I would rather, like, there's quite a lot of discussions in the present context, post pandemic. There's a civilizational existential crisis we are going through, right? With the digital, right? What is reading? What is a written word, right? When you can actually capture it and then put it on YouTube, right? When you can actually live stream this without being together, right? Sitting and talking distance from each other, touch screen, by I can touch my screen, but I cannot touch anybody else. I'm just talking to myself here, right, in my room. What is comparative mode of reading or listening or hearing, the digital mode? So the question is, also in a present context, what is literature? right? In a post-COVID, post-pandemic touch screen, held at hand with your phone probably, right? And then read it. What is reading? What is literature? And with all these historical trajectories that we are discussing here, right? So I think that's, and also quite importantly, the power structures that we are in: caste, class, gender, right, race, right, all this language, what we are living in, habituated in language, right? Both can be at once a privilege of power, but at the same time this privilege is built on actually robbing, stolen from, cultures that are, societies that are in debt, right, to us. So I think with that interesting paradigm, complex work is that as well. It is as a social purpose as well, right? So it's always an ongoing, expanding, not yet arrived state, that departments, or inquiries like culture studies, conflict, women studies, right, translation studies are all actually doing. It's acts that have to be done. There's no canon ready to imitate or live up to. So with that, very wonderful opportunity, and the opportunity of being in listening to all this important work, and questions from scholars, right? I kind of wind up my chairpersonship and call for the organizers to take over. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yes, Narmada.
So we have come to the end of the discussion. Let's wrap up this session with a thank you note. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Dickens Leonard for chairing this session and directing the discussion in a more collaborative and efficient manner. Thank you so much for being present today with us, sir, and we are really privileged to have you on board. Thank you once again. I would like to extend my gratitude to the speakers, Dr. Urmila, Assistant Professor, Department of English. Ma'am has given an insightful introduction to all of us about comparative studies. She pointed out that the basic premise for comparative studies is not just similarities, but differences and contrasts as well. In her presentation, ma'am has also mentioned about the scope of comparative studies in different areas such as culture, linguistics, mythology, etc. Thank you, ma'am, for your elaboration on comparative studies. I also extend my gratitude to Dr. Merin Wilson, Department of English, NCC College, for opening our mind to research in the area of comparative studies. Ma'am, you have given an idea of studying Mahatma's civil disobedience and the comparative study on Robert Frost's poetry and Buddhism. It was really an epiphanic moment for us. Thank you, ma'am. My special thanks to Dr. Preethi Srinivasan, Head Department of English, Queen Mary's College, for her presentation today and for organizing this fortnightly symposiums. And this in tandem research club really serves the students and scholars with the knowledge to improve and grow. Thank you, ma'am. I also thank the faculty of the Department of English, Queen Mary's College, for the dedication and commitment for serving the students. My final thanks to all the scholars and the students who are present today and give the complete attention to this session. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, Narmata.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you so
everybody. Yeah.
much.
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you, thank
We
you,
would like
thank
to learn
you.
more from you, sir, in the
Oh,
future.
surely,
Like
Ma.
to
Thank
have
you,
better interactions with you. Yeah, thank you so
thanks,
much.
Merin, and thanks, Maria.
Thank you, Dr. Dickens. So we'll catch up, and I take you at your word that you'd be willing to share your expertise with us in the days to come. So please do make time
It
for
will
us.
be my privilege. Yeah, it will be my privilege. Yeah.
And congratulations on your Fulbright.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So yeah, please join us more often. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Urmila, ma'am. Thank you, everyone, for listening patiently.
Thank you, Merin. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Urmila. Thank you. Thanks, Sumati.
It was a
Sen.
wonderful opportunity just to
Yeah,
recall.
yeah,
And
yeah.
Thank you,
With
Preeti.
all
Thank
the
you so
admission
much.
work and all, it was a refreshing change. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Preeti. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
Vinita and all, after seeing names and numbers, it's
Very
thank you,
nice.
Senyavel. So I'll see you as an expert in comparative literature, getting your degree from Harvard University. Okay?
Thank you so much for your blessings, ma'am.
Yeah, we are
Yeah,
all
sure.
with you, Miss Senyavel.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, bye everyone. I'm
Okay,
signing off.
bye, everybody.
Bye, ma'am.
Bye.
Bye. Bye,
Bye,
Preeti.
Smriti. Happy journey. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Preeti. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Ma'am.